The backyard was alive with chatter and laughter. Kids ran barefoot across the lawn, their shrieks of joy blending with the crackle of the barbecue. The family reunion was in full swing, and Jason found comfort in the familiar routine. He stood at the grill, carefully turning the burgers, his face warm from the fire and the late summer sun. "Jason, you're burning them," a voice teased from behind him. It was his cousin Grace, grinning as she held a plate of potato salad. Jason laughed. "Never. You know these are Dad's famous slow-cooked burgers. They take time." She shook her head, smiling. "Well, if they taste half as good as they smell, I'm not worried." Jason wiped his hands on a dish towel, his eyes drifting to Amber, who was a few feet away, laughing with a group of their cousins. She wore a sundress, her golden hair catching the light as she tossed her head back in laughter. A soft, affectionate smile tugged at Jason's lips. She looked radiant as always. "Hey, babe," Jason called out, his voice carrying over the murmur of conversations. "You want a beer?" Amber glanced over her shoulder, her smile still in place. She raised her nearly empty wine glass, her eyes slightly glazed from the alcohol. "Nah, I'm good with this," she replied, turning back to her group. Jason shrugged, turning his attention back to the grill. He didn't mind. Amber had always been the life of the party, and she deserved to unwind. The reunion was, after all, the one time of year they let loose a little. He poked at a steak on the grill, enjoying the scent of sizzling meat. Derek wandered over, whiskey glass in hand, his steps a little uneven. Jason's younger brother was already on his third or fourth drink, but Jason didn't think much of it. Derek had always been the wild one, loud, charismatic, and always pushing the limits. "Man, these burgers are worth the drive alone," Derek said, clapping Jason on the back, his words slurring slightly. Jason chuckled, adjusting the spatula in his hand. "Only the best for the family reunion. It's Dad's recipe. You remember how he used to get on us about getting the timing just right?" "Dad and his obsession with perfection," Derek said, smirking. "You're the only one who took it seriously." Jason smiled, but there was a tension between them, something unspoken. They had grown apart in recent years, but today, like all family events, they pretended everything was fine. "I try to make him proud," Jason said, his voice quieter now. Derek took a long swig of his drink, his eyes distant for a moment. "Yeah, you do." He paused before his usual smirk returned. "But don't let it go to your head. You're only good at a couple of things, man." Jason rolled his eyes, the familiar banter easing some of the tension. "That's funny, coming from the guy who barely managed to graduate college." Derek let out a loud laugh, drawing a few glances from nearby family members. "Hey, I made it through, didn't I? Besides, I'm doing just fine now." Jason glanced around, taking in the scene. The kids were now racing each other to the big oak tree at the edge of the yard. Grace had joined a group of aunts who were setting up the dessert table, and the older men were gathered in a circle, deep in conversation about football. It was a scene of warmth, family, and peace. But there was an edge to Jason's thoughts he couldn't shake. Maybe it was just the stress of hosting or the little cracks he had been noticing in his relationship with Amber lately. They'd been married for 10 years, and though things seemed fine on the surface, something had felt off recently. He couldn't put his finger on it, just a sense that Amber was distant, her smiles a little more forced, her touch less frequent. He shook off the thought as Amber approached, her smile bright as she looped her arm through his. "The grill master hard at work," she teased, peeking over at the burgers. "You've really outdone yourself this year." Jason grinned. "I aim to please." "Speaking of pleasing," she said, lowering her voice, "I was thinking maybe after everyone heads home, we could—" "Jason," Derek interrupted, slinging an arm around Jason's shoulder, his whiskey glass dangerously close to tipping. "You're not going to believe what happened at work the other day." Jason shot Amber an apologetic look as Derek launched into a long, rambling story. Amber's smile faltered slightly, but she waved it off, stepping back. "I'll leave you boys to it," she said, her tone light, but Jason noticed the flicker of irritation in her eyes as she walked away. "Derek, you couldn't have waited 5 minutes?" Jason muttered, trying to keep the annoyance out of his voice. Derek, oblivious, continued his story, gesturing wildly with his glass. "So then I tell the guy, no way you're getting that project done by Friday. And he's all. Jason nodded absently, his eyes following Amber as she rejoined her friends. She was laughing again, but now Jason felt the distance between them more keenly. He sighed, turning back to his brother. As the evening wore on, Jason mingled with family, keeping a careful eye on the food. He and Amber exchanged polite smiles and brief touches, but there was a growing sense of unease he couldn't ignore. Derek, now visibly drunk, was becoming more animated, cracking inappropriate jokes and stumbling over his words. At one point, Jason saw Amber and Derek whispering near the drinks table. His brother's hand lingered on Amber's back a moment too long. Jason frowned, feeling a twinge of discomfort. But he shook it off. This was his brother, his family. They were all just having fun. "Jason, these steaks are amazing," his uncle called out, pulling him back to the grill. Jason forced a smile, his unease still simmering beneath the surface. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, the family gathered around the bonfire. Jason took a seat next to Amber, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. For a moment, he felt the warmth of the fire and the comfort of his family, and the earlier tension faded. Amber leaned into him, her voice soft in his ear. "It's a perfect evening, isn't it?" Jason nodded, relaxing into the moment. "Yeah, it is." But as he glanced across the fire and saw Derek watching them, that sense of unease returned, sharper this time. Derek quickly looked away, but something in his expression sent a chill down Jason's spine. He didn't know it then, but that brief look was the beginning of the storm that would soon tear his world apart. The fire crackled softly as the family gathered around, the last light of day fading into night. The atmosphere was warm, cozy even, with the scent of burning wood and the sound of marshmallows sizzling over the flames. Jason sat back, his arm draped lazily around Amber's shoulders. It had been a long but satisfying day, filled with food, laughter, and memories. The familiar faces of his family, the relaxed smiles, made him feel content. This was the life he had always wanted. Amber leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. She had been drinking more than usual tonight, but Jason didn't mind. It was a celebration, after all. She deserved to let loose. He reached over and topped off her glass with wine, smiling as she giggled and took a sip. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting long shadows. Jason looked around at the familiar faces, feeling the sense of family wash over him. His cousin Grace was sharing a story about an awkward work meeting, which had the group in stitches. Derek, sitting across the fire, laughed along, though his laughter sounded forced. Jason barely noticed the tension on his brother's face, chalking it up to the alcohol. It wasn't unusual for Derek to drink too much at these events. They all did. He dismissed it as nothing. "Hey, everybody," Amber suddenly said, her voice rising above the casual chatter. Jason turned to her, a bit surprised. Her cheeks were flushed from the wine, and she was wobbling slightly as she stood up. "Amber, sit down, you're going to fall," Jason said softly, reaching out to steady her. But she pulled away, swaying slightly as she raised her glass. "I've got something to say," she announced, her voice louder now, slurring at the edges. The group quieted, a few chuckles rising as they assumed she was about to make some drunken joke. Jason frowned, a knot of unease forming in his stomach. He glanced over at Derek, whose face had gone pale. His brother's hands gripped his whiskey glass tightly, his knuckles turning white. Amber took a deep breath, looking around at the family gathered before her. She swayed a little, but didn't sit down. Jason's confusion deepened. Why was she acting so strange? "I've been sleeping with Derek's brother for 5 years, she slurred, her voice cutting through the warm evening like a blade. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Jason's mind blanked as the words hung in the air, their meaning slowly sinking in. He blinked, trying to process what she had just said. There had to be some mistake. "What the hell?" he whispered, barely able to form the word. His heart pounded in his chest, his ears ringing. "I've been screwing your brother," Amber repeated, louder now, her voice carrying over the fire. "For 5 years. The air seemed to vanish from Jason's lungs. He felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. His eyes moved to Derek, who was staring at the ground, avoiding his gaze. It was true. The shame and guilt were written all over his face. The others around the fire gasped. Conversations halted abruptly, laughter dying as everyone stared, first at Amber, then at Jason. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, suffocating him. His mind raced, trying to grasp the reality of what he had just heard. Amber wasn't done. "Honestly, I don't regret a damn thing," she spat, her eyes now sharp with defiance, the slurring fading. "We did it even when you were at home, behind your back. And you know what? It was some of the best sex I've ever had." Jason's whole body felt numb. His chest tightened as he struggled to breathe. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His wife, the woman he loved, the mother of his children, was standing there, laughing off their marriage, bragging about her affair. And with his own brother. "Amber, what the hell are you saying?" Jason's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Amber's eyes flicked toward him briefly, but they held no remorse. "You heard me," she said, her tone cold. 5 years, and I'd do it again." Jason's hands trembled as he tried to stand. His legs felt weak beneath him, like they might give out at any second. His heart hammered in his chest, a mix of anger and pain tearing through him. Then Derek, still avoiding Jason's eyes, gave a weak smile. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even regret. He raised his phone slowly, his thumb moving over the screen. "We even filmed ourselves doing it," he said, his voice cracking but still with that smirk. "Want to see?" Jason froze, his brain unable to comprehend the words. It was like a nightmare unfolding before him. Everyone was watching now, eyes wide in disbelief. Derek wasn't bluffing. He tapped the screen of his phone, and suddenly, the sound of vulgar moaning filled the air. The family sat there, wide-eyed, too stunned to move. Jason's vision blurred with fury. Every muscle in his body tensed, his fists clenched at his sides. His brother, the man he had trusted all his life, was playing videos of his betrayal in front of everyone. Jason's mind snapped like a tightly coiled spring. He lunged without a second thought, pure rage guiding his every movement. His body moved faster than his mind could process, and before anyone could react, his hands were around Derek's collar. "You bastard!" he screamed. The force of the impact sent his brother crashing to the ground. The crackle of the bonfire grew distant, drowned by the blood pounding in Jason's ears. "How could you?" Jason's voice was raw, his throat burning as the words erupted from deep within him. He pinned Derek to the ground, the shock on his brother's face barely registering. Years of pent-up frustration, trust shattered, and betrayal erupted in one violent punch. His fist connected with Derek's jaw, a sickening thud echoing into the stunned silence around the fire. Derek groaned, his hands instinctively trying to push Jason away, but he was no match for the fury coursing through Jason's veins. Jason drew back his fist and slammed it down again, his knuckles splitting against Derek's skin. He didn't feel the pain. He didn't care. "Jason, stop!" Grace yelled, rushing toward him, but Jason barely heard her. His vision was blurred with anger, the sound of his pulse roaring in his ears. He shoved Derek again, the wood behind him creaking under the force. "You disgusting snake!" Jason roared, his voice shaking with uncontainable rage. "How could you do this to me? How could you betray me like this?" He grabbed a fistful of Derek's shirt, lifting him slightly off the ground before slamming him back down with a force that made the ground beneath them tremble. "You slept with my wife," Jason growled, his face inches from his brother's. "You ruined everything. You both did." Derek, still dazed from the punch, raised his hands in a weak attempt to push Jason away. I'm sorry," he muttered, but the apology was hollow. Jason could hear the lack of sincerity in his brother's voice, the cowardice. Amber stood a few feet away, her face now paling, the earlier defiance gone. She didn't move to stop Jason. She didn't say a word. Around them, the family was paralyzed. Some stood frozen in disbelief. Others turned away, unable to watch the horror unfold. The sounds of the fire popping and cracking mingled with muffled gasps, but no one moved to intervene. Derek struggled beneath Jason, his lips split, blood trickling from his nose. He coughed, his words slurred and weak. Jason, stop." His voice was barely a whisper, a mixture of pain and panic. But Jason didn't care. This wasn't about his brother's suffering. It was about justice, a twisted sense of payback for the 5 years of deception that had been unfolding right under his nose. "I'll serve you karma. You hear me?" Jason growled, his breath hot and heavy. He lifted his fist again, ready to strike, but a voice cut through the haze of his anger. "Jason, stop!" Amber's voice was shaky and slurred, but she stumbled toward them, her eyes wide with panic. Her earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by fear. She swayed, barely able to stand on her own feet, her hands fumbling as she tried to get close. Jason turned his head slowly, glaring at her, his chest heaving with exertion. "You!" He pointed at Amber, his hand shaking. "You did this. You destroyed everything." Amber stepped back, her face pale and tear-streaked. "I didn't," she started, but Jason cut her off. "Don't you dare try to explain this," he screamed, his voice cracking. "You think you can say sorry? You think this just goes away?" Amber covered her face, her shoulders trembling as the weight of her actions finally seemed to hit her. "Jason, please, I didn't mean—" Jason threw his hands up in exasperation. "You didn't mean what? To destroy our family? To throw away 10 years of marriage for this?" He gestured angrily to Derek, who was still lying on the ground, gasping for breath. "I was drunk, Amber tried to explain, but her words faltered, and she stumbled forward again, reaching out toward Jason. Jason stepped back, his face twisted in disgust. "You think being drunk makes this okay? 5 years, Amber. 5 years, behind my back, with my own brother." His voice shook as the full weight of the betrayal pressed down on him. He glanced at Derek, who was slowly sitting up, his face a mess of blood and bruises. Jason took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the rage inside him wouldn't let go. "You think this is over?" he growled, his eyes locking onto Derek's. "You think a few punches make us even?" Derek winced, wiping blood from his mouth. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The pain and guilt had robbed him of any excuses. Jason grabbed the front of Derek's shirt again, lifting him halfway off the ground. "You ruined everything," Jason hissed through clenched teeth. "My marriage, our family. How could you do this? How could you sleep with her, knowing what it would do to me?" Derek, his voice hoarse, tried to stammer an apology. Jason, I didn't—" "Shut up!" Jason roared, his face inches from Derek's. "You don't get to apologize. You don't get to make this right." Amber, still trembling, tried to step forward again, her hand outstretched. "Jason, please, don't you dare touch me," Jason snarled, his eyes blazing as he turned to her. "You think you're innocent in this? You stood there, smiling, laughing, while you destroyed our lives." "I didn't." Amber's voice cracked, but Jason's expression silenced her. "You did this," Jason shouted, his voice breaking. "You threw away everything we had for this?" He let go of Derek's shirt and stood up, towering over them both. His fists were still clenched, blood trickling from his knuckles, but he was too furious to feel the pain. "You think your tears mean anything now?" Jason's voice was hollow as he looked down at Amber. She was sobbing openly now, her body shaking uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," she cried out, her voice desperate. "Jason, please, I'm sorry." "I didn't—" "Stop," Jason said, his voice suddenly calm, terrifyingly calm. "Just stop." He turned to look at the rest of the family. They were watching, horrified, but no one moved to intervene. Jason took a deep breath, his body shaking with the effort to control himself. "You think you both deserve each other?" Jason muttered, his voice filled with disdain. He glanced at Derek, who had managed to sit up, cradling his bleeding face in his hands. "You've ruined everything, and you don't even care." Jason walked away, his fists still trembling, his heart still pounding. He didn't know where he was going or what he would do next. All he knew was that everything he had built, everything he had loved, had been shattered in one night of betrayal. And there was no fixing it. There was only the cold, bitter reality of what his life had become. The cold night air hit Jason's face as he sped down the highway, headlights blurring through the wet glaze of his tear-filled eyes. The reunion was a distant nightmare now, but the rage was still boiling inside him, pushing him towards something darker. His mind raced as he gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice barely audible in the empty car. "I'll make them pay for everything." The thought of Amber's mocking laughter, her cruel words ringing out in front of their family, made his stomach churn. And Derek, his own brother, playing those videos like it was some kind of sick joke. Jason's heart pounded harder, each thump echoing the same thought: revenge. He pulled over at a quiet rest stop, slamming the car door behind him. The cold wind bit at his skin as he paced around the empty lot, his breath coming out in harsh, ragged bursts. His mind was no longer rational. He wasn't thinking about reconciliation or moving on. He wanted to see them both suffer, to destroy them the way they had destroyed him. Asterisk, how could they do this? How could they betray me like that? Asterisk, Jason took out his phone and stared at it for a long moment. An idea began to form, sharp and clear amidst the haze of his anger. He wasn't just going to hurt them. He was going to dismantle their entire lives piece by piece. The first call he made was to his lawyer. He wasn't about to let Amber walk away with any of his hard-earned money. "Not a single cent, Jason, it's late." "What's going on?" His lawyer, Bill, answered groggily. "I need to start divorce proceedings immediately," Jason said, his voice cold and measured. "I want her to get nothing. I mean nothing." Bill hesitated on the other end. Jason slowed down. "What happened?" "She cheated on me," Jason growled, "for 5 years with my brother. I want her out of my life, and I don't want her to walk away with anything. Can you make that happen?" There was a pause. Then Bill's voice softened. "I'm sorry to hear that, Jason. We can start the process, but these things take time. You'll need evidence." "Don't worry about that. I've got all the evidence I need." The second part of Jason's plan involved digging deep into Derek's life. Jason had known for years that Derek kept his personal videos and files stored in the cloud, and in the past, it had been more of a sibling joke, the younger brother who didn't care about privacy. But now, that weakness was going to be his downfall. Jason wasn't a tech genius, but he knew enough. After a few hours of combing through old emails and online accounts, he found the backdoor into Derek's cloud storage. His stomach twisted as he began downloading the files, his heart pounding as each video loaded on his screen. It wasn't just Amber. Derek had been reckless, recording intimate encounters with multiple women, some of them people they both knew. As Jason watched the videos, a strange sense of detachment washed over him. It was like watching the final pieces of his old life disintegrate in front of his eyes. Each file he downloaded fueled his anger more, but it also gave him something he needed: control. With these videos, he could do anything. He could ruin Derek's relationships, his career, his entire life. "I'll burn everything down," Jason muttered, leaning back in his chair, his eyes still glued to the screen. "They'll regret ever crossing me." But simply having the videos wasn't enough. Jason wanted the fallout to be public, to see the humiliation on their faces when everyone knew the truth. He wasn't going to let them off easy. The first email went out the next morning. It was anonymous, sent to a few select members of their extended family. Jason knew this would start rumors, but that was just the beginning. As he pressed send, he imagined the shock, the whispers, the slow unraveling of his brother's perfect facade. The texts began coming in by the afternoon. "Jason, have you seen this?" One cousin messaged him, attaching a screenshot of the email that had started circulating. Jason didn't reply. He didn't need to. He was waiting for the real storm to hit. Days passed, and the whispers grew louder. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from family members and mutual friends. Some were concerned, others were curious, but all were shocked. The videos hadn't gone viral yet, but it was only a matter of time. Jason had strategically sent them to people who couldn't keep a secret if their lives depended on it. But even as the rumors started to swirl, Jason wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. He wanted them both to suffer publicly, not just in the closed circles of their family and friends. A week later, Jason made his next move. He created an anonymous online account and began posting the videos on websites where they would get attention. He made sure to blur certain faces, keep it vague enough that it wouldn't lead directly back to him, at least not yet. But the damage was done. Derek's phone blew up. His colleagues found out, and soon enough, it wasn't just family gossip. His reputation at work was in shambles. People whispered behind his back. His boss pulled him into meetings, asking if the rumors were true. Derek denied everything, but the evidence was too damning. Amber wasn't faring any better. The humiliation of having her affair exposed to their social circle was unbearable. She stopped going out. Her friends stopped answering her calls. She was trapped in her own web of lies, suffocating under the weight of the truth Jason had unleashed. And yet, for Jason, it still wasn't enough. Every time he saw their names in a message, every time he heard about the chaos unfolding in their lives, he felt a flicker of satisfaction. But it didn't last. The rage was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, pushing him to do more, to go further. Jason sat in his car one evening, parked outside Derek's apartment. The night was cold, and he watched as the lights flickered on inside. He knew Derek was home, probably trying to figure out how to salvage the wreckage of his life. Jason's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Amber. "Jason, please, can we talk? I know I messed up. I'm sorry. Just please stop." Jason stared at the message for a long time, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. For the first time since the reunion, a wave of exhaustion washed over him. But it wasn't the kind of tired that came from lack of sleep. It was deeper, like his entire soul had been drained. He didn't reply to Amber's message. Instead, he leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, the cold air seeping into the car. Revenge had consumed him, but for the first time, he wondered what would be left of him when it was all over. Months passed, but the anger that coursed through Jason's veins showed no signs of abating. Every morning, he woke with the same bitter taste in his mouth, the sting of betrayal as fresh as it had been that night at the family reunion. Amber and Derek's lives had begun to crumble around them, just as he had planned. Their reputations were in tatters. They had been ostracized by friends and family, and Derek had even lost his job. But despite all this, Jason felt no satisfaction. Instead, he was drowning in his own hatred, consumed by it. He had cut ties with almost everyone, including those who tried to help. His friends couldn't reach him anymore. His parents had stopped calling, unable to watch their son spiral further into despair. Jason hardly left his apartment, his life narrowing to a suffocating routine of work, drink, and endless rage-filled thoughts. One cold evening, after downing several glasses of whiskey, Jason stared at the pile of empty bottles on his kitchen table. His mind wandered to Derek and Amber, and a familiar fury bubbled up inside him, more intense than ever. He needed to confront Derek, to look him in the eye one last time. Fueled by alcohol and the need for closure, Jason grabbed his car keys and stormed out the door. He drove to Derek's apartment, the road blurring as he sped through the city. The streets were quiet, the night heavy with the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Jason barely registered the stoplights, the turns. His focus was singular. Derek's apartment was small, a far cry from the confident, easygoing man who once boasted about his carefree life. The windows were dark as Jason approached, but he knew Derek was home. He pounded on the door, fists hammering against the wood until he heard shuffling from inside. The door cracked open slightly, revealing Derek's pale, tired face. He blinked in confusion, clearly not expecting his brother. "What the hell, Jason?" Derek mumbled, squinting at the harsh hallway light. He reeked of alcohol, the apartment behind him a mess of empty bottles and clothes strewn everywhere. His life had fallen apart, but Jason didn't care. "You ruined everything," Jason shouted, his voice raw with anger. He shoved the door open and stormed inside before Derek could react. Derek stumbled back, his eyes widening in shock. "What are you talking about? I've already lost everything, Jason. What more do you want?" Jason's hands clenched into fists. "You think losing your job and some friends makes up for what you did? You destroyed my marriage, my life, and you think you could just go on living like nothing happened?" He took a step forward, towering over Derek. Derek backed away, his face tight with fear. "Jason, I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean for things to go this far. I messed up. We both did. But this isn't going to solve anything. His voice cracked with desperation, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside Jason. No, Jason spat, his face inches from Derek's now. It's too late for sorry. You took everything from me, and now it's time for you to pay. Jason's hands shot out, grabbing Derek by the throat. The surge of power, the need for revenge, overwhelmed him. He squeezed, watching as Derek gasped, clawing at Jason's wrists, trying to break free. You think you can take my life away from me and just walk away unscathed? Jason's voice was low, vibrating with fury. You think I'll let you? Derek tried to speak, but no words came. His face turned red, his eyes wide with panic. In that moment, something shifted in Jason. The years of pent-up rage were no longer just words. He was acting on the hatred, and it felt unstoppable. Suddenly, Derek's legs buckled beneath him as he tried to escape Jason's grip. He flailed, stumbling backward, and in one horrifying moment, Jason pushed him harder. Derek's body twisted awkwardly as he fell, his head slamming against the sharp edge of the coffee table. The crack that followed was deafening. Time seemed to stop as Jason froze, his breath catching in his throat. Derek lay on the floor, motionless, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood began to pool around him, staining the carpet a dark, sickening red. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of what had just happened hitting him like a tidal wave. He took a step back, his hands shaking, eyes wide with disbelief. No, 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 Jason whispered, stumbling backward. His vision blurred as panic set in. What had he done? This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had wanted revenge, but not like this. Not this. He knelt down beside Derek, his hands hovering over his brother's lifeless body, unsure of what to do. Derek's chest didn't rise or fall. His eyes stared blankly ahead. Derek! Jason's voice cracked as he shook his brother's shoulders, but there was no response. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by Jason's ragged breaths. A distant voice echoed in his ears. Was it a neighbor? Jason didn't know. All he could focus on was the horror in front of him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but nothing fit. This wasn't supposed to happen. The police arrived minutes later, the sound of sirens piercing the night. A neighbor had heard the commotion and called 911, but it was too late. The officers burst into the apartment, finding Jason kneeling beside Derek's body, blood on his hands. Stand up. Hands where we can see them. One officer shouted, gun drawn. Jason didn't resist. He didn't move. His mind was numb, his body heavy with the weight of what he had done. Slowly, he stood up, his hands raised in surrender. The officers moved quickly, cuffing him, reading him his rights, but Jason didn't hear them. His world had crumbled, and there was no going back. As they let him out of the apartment, Jason caught one last glimpse of Derek's lifeless body. The hatred that had fueled him for so long was gone now, replaced by a hollow emptiness. He had sought revenge, and in the end, it had cost him everything. Amber sat alone in her apartment, the news of Derek's death hitting her like a freight train. She had lost everything, her marriage, her dignity, and now her lover. She wept silently, realizing too late the price of her betrayal. Jason had lost everything, but in the end, so had she.